Today, Recover Irish Aviation speaking with Dr. Niamh Power on the topic of antigen testing. Niamh, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Nick.
So, Niamh, you are a doctor, a pilot, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons and most recently running V1 Medical. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I went to university after school, went to UCD and graduated in medicine there, and I worked in the Irish Health Service for about 5 years, most of my training in the Mater Hospital. I worked in James's, St Vincent's and a couple of the other hospitals, regional hospitals around the country. I graduated I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. And then in 1999, I was lucky enough to be offered a cadetship with Aer Lingus, and I've been flying with them since. Currently, I'm flying on the A330, which does the bulk of the long haul and transatlantic work.
So tell us a little bit about your company, V1 Medical, and how you came to set it up.
Yeah, so coming into last winter, we recognised that while a lot of countries were accepting antigen testing for travel, there was no suppliers of antigen testing in Dublin or anywhere else that we could see. And we realised that people who needed to travel weren't being facilitated. So we really set up V1 Medical as a way of facilitating what was at the time essential travel for people who needed to go. So right now we're doing mostly testing for flight crew, shipping crew, engineering workers who work on infrastructure projects in Europe. And we find that our test, it's quick, it's flexible, they can make their flights, they can change their times if their schedule changes. It really just makes it much easier for them to go about their everyday business that they need to.
So one of the things we want to speak about today is last week's Transport Committee meeting with NPHET and their attitude towards antigen testing. Just as a quick overview, what was your take on NPHET's attitude towards antigen testing in a travel context?
Yeah, so I watched that hearing and really overwhelmingly disappointed with the attitude that NPHET had. It seemed that there was no real ability or will, I suppose, to have an open mind about antigen testing, particularly in relation to international travel. They were very quick to shut down any of the good arguments that were made for antigen testing. And yeah, overall it was just very disappointing for me and any of my aviation colleagues who were watching as well.
NPHET quoted evidence supporting their view of antigen testing from the Infectious Disease Society of America, amongst others, who believe that antigen tests are not effective in situations of low prevalence of COVID-19 amongst asymptomatic people. Would you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I read that briefing from the Infectious Disease Society of America, and there was a video briefing, a Q&A that went along with it. And that isn't actually what they said. Their advice about asymptomatic screening with antigen testing was in a population with moderate to high incidence of infection, and they cited 5% prevalence of 5% and above. We're nowhere near that in Ireland or Europe. We haven't been for some time, if ever. Their main concerns with regard to asymptomatic testing and when they were referenced travel especially was with incoming travel from very high prevalence, and they mentioned India as being an area of concern. If you look at what's going on in America and the US, and of course the Infectious Disease Society of America are mainly interested in the US, travel is open. Nobody needs testing to travel internally in the US, a domestic market of 330 million people. Some airlines are instigating antigen testing as an extra layer of protection for their customers, but it's not like it is in Europe where we are mandatorily tested when travelling. So while I take on board their points, it's not really relevant to the discussion we're having in Europe at the moment.
Well, speaking about Europe then, last week Professor Mary Keoghan stated that many countries in Europe are not using antigen testing. Is that what you understand the situation to be?
So again, first of all, in relation to aviation, most European countries now accept antigen testing for international travel on the same basis as they do PCR testing or vaccination. So I don't think it's true to say that most countries in Europe aren't doing antigen testing. On an internal basis, there's many European countries that are using asymptomatic screening, antigen testing for asymptomatic screening in their population. Look at Denmark, they're doing upwards of almost 500,000 antigen tests daily for screening processes. The UK, while not technically in the European Union, are using antigen testing, free antigen tests for businesses and schools in order to keep their case numbers down and quickly identify outbreaks. So I'm not sure where she got the evidence that European countries aren't doing antigen testing. I don't think that's fair to say.
Obviously, Europe is on the world stage at the moment with the Euros, and Dublin was supposed to stage a match next Tuesday night. We're here looking at all these countries across Europe with full stadiums, with thousands of people watching games, whereas we're not even allowed into restaurants. Is antigen testing part of that, or have they just opened up?
No, as I understand it, all those full or almost full stadia that you see hosting the Euros, and like you say, we were to be a host nation. We gave that up because we weren't willing to accommodate fans at games. They're using antigen testing to screen their fans. They're, 25,000 people in a stadium, and it's antigen testing that's allowing that to happen.
So if we go along the lines of some of NPHET's commentary, that, Professor Cillian de Gascon stated last week that rapid antigen tests will miss 1 in every 2 asymptomatic cases, with the CMO stating that they're essentially as good as a flip of a coin. Are we expecting to see lots of cases come out of this in the next few weeks, do you think?
I think the flip of the coin and the 1 in 2 cases is a disingenuous thing to say. So if the question is antigen testing missing 1 in 2 people who may have viral RNA in their nose, well, yes, I'm not going to dispute that. I think that's fairly accepted across the literature. But are we really interested in finding people who have dead viral RNA in their nose? Or are we not more interested in finding the people who are actually, infectious and who are a danger and who need to be, informed that they are infectious and need to self-isolate? So the flick of the coin analogy is disingenuous at best. It's very disappointing.
So arguably for travel, the biggest argument is not importing cases, especially where it concerns new variants. NPHET is suggesting that, antigen testing is only 52% effective when compared with PCR. So why would we not just use PCR? How do you think NPHET came to that? So
again, there's 2 issues there. One is antigen testing only 52% sensitive in finding infectious cases? And that's clearly not true. If we look at cases looking at people who are likely to be infectious based on viral load, well then antigen testing will pick up upwards of 97-98% of those people. So the idea that screening with antigen for travel is going to allow 50% of cases on an airplane just doesn't hold up. The other point about why don't we just use PCR, first of all, PCR is going to find people who aren't infectious and stop them from travelling, stop them from working, stop them from earning a living, supporting their families, because these people otherwise wouldn't have been screened. And secondly, the flexibility of antigen testing over PCR, the cost of antigen testing over PCR is immense. So PCR testing will take upwards over 24 hours, in some cases up to 48 hours to report. If you have an urgent reason to be somewhere, you don't have that time. And we at our clinic test lots of people whose schedules have to change, who may be travelling for a funeral, who may be travelling for a family illness. They can't plan that 24 or 48 hours in advance.
So how long after walking through your clinic door does somebody receive their test result?
About the time they get to the check-in desk at the airport. So we can turn around a test in about 20 minutes. We guarantee to turn it around within 30 minutes. So they come, they have their swab, it takes a couple of minutes. They head off to the airport. By the time they get their car parked, their bag sorted at the check-in desk, they'll have their result. That just can't happen with PCR testing. PCR testing is always going to be more expensive than antigen testing. It needs to go to a lab. It needs to involve medical scientists. It needs to involve logistical, courier, etc. there are so many more costs involved in doing PCR testing. Antigen testing is always going to be cheaper, and if you consider an average family going on their family holiday, 2 adults, 3 kids, those differences in costs add up to what for many people will make it an unviable exercise.
How many validation studies have taken place with antigen testing for travel? One of NPHET's big bugbears with this seems to be that not enough studies have taken place. How many of them have actually taken place?
So in Europe, there is a cooperation led by the EU Commission where the EU Commission have published a list of mutually recognised antigen tests, and they're the only tests that we are to use when we are facilitating travel. So anybody who's getting an antigen test in Europe will be tested with one of those tests. Each of those has to be validated by 2 European countries to get on that list, and then other countries can continue to validate as well. And the beauty of the list is that as new, maybe better tests arrive on the market, those can be validated and added to the list. In the same way, the tests that we find maybe aren't performing as well as they should can be taken off the list. So it is very much a live document. So the idea that these tests are, unvalidated and just brought to market without any oversight is nonsense.
I just want to read you a statement from the CMO, Dr. Tony Houlihan, last week. He said that proper assessment of suitability of COVID-19 tests has been neglected to date, with many tests brought to market without appropriate real-world evaluation or well-designed studies evaluating these tests in world settings. What do you make of that?
I think that statement came from the MHRA, which is the UK body that oversees medical devices. So I'm not sure whether they were taking into account the fact that the EU have got this mutually agreed list of tests that are all validated. So I don't agree with the statement that he's made. I think that every test that we can use for travel in Europe has been validated by at least 2 European states. So either we trust our European family and our European neighbours, or we don't.
Let's just look at the testing arrangements that we have at the moment. In order to travel into Ireland at the moment, what's the process that you need to go through?
So to travel into Ireland, you need to have a PCR test, and it must be a lab-based PCR test, which of course adds a huge cost to travel into Ireland, as well as the huge inflexibility of it. Finding a centre abroad to have your test, getting the test done on time, taking into account maybe indirect flights, because as you know, we have lost a huge amount of connectivity. So places that we used to take for granted that we could fly direct to from Dublin and from Ireland, Cork and obviously Shannon now, we can't do that anymore. So the test needs to be taken. It has to be reported on before you step on your first aircraft, and then if you have to change, connect in a different city, it needs to still be valid by the time you get here.
So how far before getting on board an aircraft, how far in advance can I take my PCR test?
So you can take your test 72 hours in advance of getting on the plane.
Effectively 3 days. How likely is it that I could pick up the virus in that time before boarding my flight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the prevalence is low, so it's not likely that you're going to pick up the virus. But having said that, there's no guarantee that just because you had a PCR test 3 days ago means that you're not going to be infectious. And in fact, when we were testing at V1 Medical, the Dutch government brought in a regulation that as well as having a PCR test within 72 hours, that people also needed to have a rapid antigen test within 4 hours of the flight. And we found quite a number of people who came to us with negative PCRs for their antigen tests on the morning of flight then who were positive. So it's not that it absolutely can happen, and it absolutely does happen. So, the idea that a negative PCR test 3 days before an event that you want to do, whether it be travel or something else, is probably not the safest way to do it.
So are you suggesting then that we should have an additional layer of an antigen test, or should we just do away with the PCR and just do antigen, or should we do both?
Well, I think that if your aim is to decrease transmission on a flight, well then I think that an antigen test before flight is probably adequate. Generally, I'm against adding layers of complexity and barriers to people getting on with their everyday life. So we need to balance, a safety issue along with allowing people to go on about their daily lives. And I think putting too many barriers is a mistake.
One of the things that was extremely interesting last week, and it kind of leads back to what we were talking about the Euros, and you mentioned 500,000 tests a week in Denmark. Professor Mary Keoghan stated that it is an absolute myth that antigen testing is quick and easy. She actually referenced the Barcelona concert that we all saw a few months ago, where 5,000 people were tested by 80 nurses working 12-hour shifts. You know, she referred to mass testing of people as extremely labour intensive. Now, for the return of travel, with the potential thousands of people a day, a week, returning to travel from the 19th of June, in your experience with your clinic, how feasible would that be for us to conduct?
Okay, so we're a relatively small clinic, but we're definitely putting through more people than the 80 nurses doing 12-hour shifts in the Barcelona example. I'm not quite sure what the logistics of that concert was, but it does seem to be very, very much overstaffed. Those numbers just don't make sense to me. And if you look at what's going on in Europe, all those Euro football matches that we're seeing, all those people are antigen tested. How are they doing it? Denmark are doing almost 500,000 antigen tests a day. How is Denmark doing it? You know, I don't agree with her point that it's not scale upable. It absolutely is, and it's not as labour intensive as she's saying. You know, the swabbing is exactly the same as for PCR testing. It's all done on site.
And are people doing these tests themselves, or are they being conducted professionally?
No, our tests are all conducted professionally. They're swabbed professionally, they're processed professionally, and then they're reported with the doctor's signature.
And is that the type of antigen testing that you're calling for travel?
Yeah, absolutely. And the EU Commission has also said this, that self-tests won't be accepted for travel. And I would agree that that's not appropriate for travel. So they will all be professionally taken and professionally reported samples.
Last week we saw a rather interesting example shown to us by Professor Mary Keoghan. Let's take another quick look at that clip.
Dr. Keoghan, briefly.
If I can just show you, now I may need a bit of a hand with the camera to right in front here. So
you need to come over a bit further, Dr. Keoghan. Yeah, we have it. Yeah.
So this is a negative result. I'm not sure if it's.
You need to come back from the camera.
Yeah, can people see?
That's fine.
There is
a
skill line at the C bar. What I did to produce this morning, and obviously I wouldn't be handling it without gloves if it had any biological material, is I just put buffer on this. And this is the reason that self-testing is not acceptable for any sort of test to enable approach. So if you just put buffer with no sample, you get a negative result. The control line just tells you that diffusion has occurred. It doesn't indicate that there's any specimen in this test. Unlike a PCR, where you will get an invalid result if there is no RNA present.
Dr. Keoghan, we're very tight on time. Just get to the heart of the matter.
It's widely publicised on the internet that if you put, it's mostly done with Diet Coke, you can get a false positive. And this is done with tonic water because it doesn't stain down below, and this looks like a positive. And this is why, because you can produce a positive, this is why any sort of positivity based on self-testing is recommended, should be confirmed. Because these tests do not have a process control in them and are open to manipulation.
That's Dr. Keoghan, finally, you're talking about self-administered rapid antigen tests, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're talking about monitoring.
Chair, I just think we like some references have been made to peer-reviewed journals, and now we're talking to the internet. I think there's obviously a distrust of people here in terms of, I know if I was asymptomatic and used an antigen test, I'd want to know if I had COVID. I think most people, if not all, would. So I'm very concerned in terms of what we've just seen there.
So on second viewing, what do you make of that?
Well, it really was an extraordinary intervention in a committee, a joint Oireachtas Transport and Communications Committee meeting that was there to discuss antigen testing for travel, which will all be professionally done. And we have this, and it doesn't get any better watching it the second time, Nick. It was just extraordinary and really had no place, there was no place for that discussion. It was a distraction.
Professor Mary Keoghan suggests there that these tests are open to manipulation. How open to manipulation are professionally conducted tests, in your opinion?
The same amount of manipulation as PCR testing done by professionals is open to, in the same way that you can buy a self-test PCR test and have it delivered to you and send it back to the lab. Self-testing and professional testing are not the same thing, and we're not advocating for self-testing for aviation. We're advocating for professional testing, which will be subject to the same controls as PCR testing. So it really is a distraction, it's a misnomer.
A large part of the argument for antigen testing is the idea of picking up asymptomatic cases as well as symptomatic cases. Last week, NPHET argued that the WHO, the ECDC and the Royal Statistical Society all believe that a lab test should be used rather than a single rapid antigen test.
I think that if your aim is to diagnose a particular person with COVID-19, well then yes, a PCR test is a better test if you're looking to use a test in a diagnostic capacity. But if you're using the test to screen people, for instance, to travel, in other words, you want to inhibit them from doing something that they would normally be able to do, well then you want a test that's not going to be positive when they may have had COVID several months ago. You only want a test to find the people who are likely to be infectious. And a PCR test is not the best test for that. It may be the most sensitive test for COVID, but it's certainly not the most specific test for infectiousness. An antigen test is far more specific for infectiousness than COVID is. So you have to ask yourself the question, what are you trying to find? Are you trying to find people who are likely to be infectious? Or are you trying to find dead DNA or dead RNA in somebody's nasal passage?
You mentioned that infectiousness and PCR versus antigen. What window of time is antigen likely to pick up this level of infectiousness when we compare it with PCR test?
Okay. So the problem really is that a PCR test will remain positive for a long time after a person is no longer infectious. And as I've said before, our concentration really and our interest really should be in just when a person is infectious. So HICWA have decided that a 10-day isolation period will cover the infectiousness of a person who tests positive for SARS-CoV-2. The studies that they used to decide a 10-day interval was based on viral culture studies, and it was based on contact tracing studies, not based on PCR positivity. And yet every time we benchmark an antigen test, we benchmark it against PCR positivity. Why not benchmark it against viral culture? Why not benchmark it against contact tracing studies? Because, as we've said, the PCR test will be positive for 16 to 24 days. And if you take the middle of that, that's 20 days. An antigen test will be positive no more than 10 days. And there's your 10 out of 20, 50%. We've heard that number before. So it's a measure of infectiousness as opposed to a measure of a PCR positivity that we really should be interested in.
Many people would suggest that with this surging of the Delta variant in the UK that we'd probably just be better off just stopping travel for the time being. Do you think that's a viable option?
Well, again, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If your only interest is delaying or stopping, because of course we can't stop the spread of COVID or the Delta variant or any other variant. And remember, there will always be variants. We probably won't hear about them much, but there will always be variants. So if your only concern is to stop the transmission of COVID, well then, yes, we should all stay at home indefinitely. But if you're interested in having the economy function and the society function in general, having people go to work, having children go to school, having people socialise, which is of course very important, well then we need to find a balance. And the balance can't be locking down. As many people have said, including a lot of those bodies that you just mentioned, lockdowns are a failure of public health. And we shouldn't be going there. It should be our very, very last line of defence. And the WHO have said that from the very, very beginning, that we shouldn't be closing international borders unless we get to a stage where our health services is at risk of being overwhelmed. And we're not there. We haven't been there at all, I think, or very, very much, we're not there now. There was maybe some time in the early days when there was just so much uncertainty, we didn't know where we were going, when you could argue that lockdown was the right thing to do. But our health service is not overwhelmed. We have very few people in hospital with COVID. And again, a lot of them are in hospital with COVID rather than because of COVID. We have very few people in an ICU and we have very few deaths. So I think that lockdowns are not an appropriate action right now.
NPHET suggests that we're doing very well in Ireland in the European context. You know, we're fifth best in terms of cases, sixth best in terms of deaths. A large part of that success is due to the restrictions on travel, is it not?
I would argue that you can't jump from one conclusion to the other. We're probably doing quite well because of lots of things. Our vaccination program is rolling out. Yes, we did have a lot of lockdown, but what we don't seem to look at, and what our public health doctors and our public health emergency team don't seem to take any notice of, is all the things, the harms that are happening because of lockdowns and because of the very strict rules we have in this country. You know, again, if you look at what's going on in Europe and the US, society is essentially function as normal or almost as normal. So to say that we're doing very well when our metrics are more or less in line with other European countries, and we're often compared with Denmark because it's a country with a similar population as ours, you know, our metrics are in line with what Denmark are doing. But you know, you can go about pretty much normal life in Denmark. You can go to the football match, you can go to the restaurant, you can go to the pub.
And is antigen testing in use in Denmark for travel?
Yes, it is. Denmark have been accepting antigen testing for travel for many months now, at least since Christmas. And they use a lot of antigen testing, asymptomatic testing centres all over the cities. And I'm not sure whether I mentioned it earlier on when you were talking about Dr. Keoghan's assertion that it was difficult to do. They're doing almost 500,000 antigen tests a day, as well as their PCR capacity. I think it's around 80,000 PCR tests they do a day. So, you know, I think that they are a functional society with good COVID metrics. We are a dysfunctional society with roughly the same COVID metrics.
We have such high capacity of PCR testing capability that why bother with an antigen test if PCR is the gold standard test? Why bother with them?
Well, for several reasons. First of all, is our PCR capacity, you know, so high? We're doing, I think Dr. Hulin said 175,000 PCR tests a week. And again, compare that with Denmark's 80,000 plus PCR tests a day. So, you know, clearly we aren't doing a huge amount of PCR testing. And secondly, you know, why bother with antigen testing? Bother with it because it's easy. It gives a rapid result. It allows people to do things that they wouldn't ordinarily, not ordinarily, that's the wrong word, in the current situation that they wouldn't ordinarily be allowed to do. The idea that we're allowing and disallowing people from doing things, and when there is a better way, when there is another way to enable people to live normally.
Would it not be fair to say, though, that if somebody tests negatively on a very cheap, easy to conduct or have conducted antigen test, that they're more likely to be a little bit reckless?
Yeah, I think this is something that's been thrown out from a few quarters, and well, first of all, there's no real evidence to back this up. In fact, the SMART study from Liverpool looked at this very issue and this very point, and they concluded that no, people weren't more likely to engage in reckless behaviour. In fact, you know, it's arguably people who take the bother of doing an antigen test, whether it's a self-test or a professionally done test, in order to feel safer about undergoing a task or a meeting, that those are the responsible people. And then when you reflect it in the aviation environment, we have very well controlled environments, whether it be at airports or in airplanes. We have situations that passengers have to comply with. And we won't tolerate bad behaviour in the aviation environment. People need to wear their masks, they need to social distance, they need to do everything they're instructed to do. So the idea of people will behave badly if they test negative doesn't wash in aviation. And bearing in mind that people who are PCR tested, potentially, if you're going to argue that negative antigen tests will make people reckless, maybe negative PCR tests 3 days ago would also make people reckless. But no, I don't agree with it. There's no evidence to support that idea. Well, it's hard to see that they are following the science when they aren't even reading the reports that are commissioned by the Department of Health clearly on subjects like rapid testing that would help to open up our society and help us to function as a society. So they might be following the science, but I wonder if it's a certain cohort of science. The Ferguson report was chaired by Professor Mark Ferguson, who's the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Irish Government, along with 5 other experts in their fields, 2 public health experts and 3 experts in virology and immunology and infectious diseases. And their remit was to look at the role of rapid testing in Ireland's COVID-19 response. And they overwhelmingly came out, now of course to say that the 2 NPHET public health experts were dissenting on the report. But the report in the whole overwhelmingly came out in support of using rapid testing, including rapid antigen testing, in order to open up our society. They came up with several recommendations to the government to start doing trials. And remember that this report was published on the 1st of April, and it had been in writing for several months before that. So you know, none of this will have or should have been news to anybody who read the report. But yeah, it recommended that we should do, I think the wording was that we should at speed roll out pilot studies to use antigen testing in the community and in business and in travel.
And to your knowledge, how many of those recommendations have taken place?
Very few. I do know that the HSE was involved in a pilot study in the meat meat processing sector. When interestingly enough, they have moved now from their what they felt at the time presumably was adequate screening of monthly PCR testing for meat factory workers. And considering that, you know, the meat plants were a huge reservoir of infection in their communities, that does seem to be well, a little bit nonsensical really. So they're now using antigen testing in the meat processing sector. And Minister Simon Harris is beginning a pilot project in the higher education sector, hopefully so that all the students that missed an entire year of university life last year will be able to be on campus next year.
So how long has this report been in existence? How long has this report been sitting on the desk of the likes of NPHET, the ministers?
Since the 1st of April.
Since the 1st of April. And has this report been discussed by NPHET?
So that was a question that was twice asked and once answered at the committee hearing. To, I think, everybody's utter disbelief, Dr. Ronan Glynn confirmed that no, it hadn't been considered by NPHET at all.
What do you, as a doctor, as a pilot, as somebody running an antigen testing clinic, what do you make of this idea that our public health officials advising the government on our strategy for dealing with COVID-19 haven't even discussed a government-commissioned report on the topic of antigen testing?
Yes or no, Professor or Dr. Holohan, as you chair NPHET, can you confirm it was or wasn't discussed?
We dealt with this question earlier, Deputy. I indicated that for personal reasons I wasn't in the chair during that time period. The Minister set up the process and designed it, if you like, requested the process to report directly back to the Minister.
So it wasn't discussed. Thank you.
Dr. Glynn was in the chair during that time period. I did say all this earlier on.
I don't know what to say, Nick, to that question apart from unbelievable, and you know, I really do wonder how the very busy and hard-working professors and doctors who spent their time collating and writing that report, I mean, what an insult to their time, what an insult.
So we heard last week that whether we use antigen or not is essentially a decision for government. If you could speak to government directly now on this topic, what would you say to them?
I would say that NPHET are advisors to government, and their job is to advise. Government's job is to make decisions. And government's job is to be balanced in that decision making. So they need to hear from NPHET, but they also need to hear from businesses, they need to hear from economists, they need to hear from ordinary citizens of this country. And they need to make a decision. And they need to make a decision that we need to start living again. We need to have a functional society. We need to have a society that's able to fund the health service as well as all the other public services going forward. And I don't see how that's going to happen if we keep locked up the way we are.
Dr. Niamh Power, thank you.
Thank you, Nick.